This lesson is about trigonometric functions, specifically discovering the graph for tangent in a very organic way that relates to its geometric definition. So we're going to review the different geometric definitions of trigonometric functions, as well as I'm going to give you a brief history lesson. So the first trigonometric function was actually the chord function. All right, so all trigonometry, even though it's a study of the measure of triangles, is actually rooted in spherics, which is essentially astronomy, in which you're measuring distances of objects in the sky. And so the chord was particularly an interesting function to create, and for a long time they didn't see it as a function of an angle, that distance, but Indian astronomers created tables that basically were the first ones to situate it in this way. And eventually they decided that it was actually a little bit easier, because if you think about it, if we're standing on the ground, we don't really need this whole distance of what's above us. We're kind of in this hemisphere above us. We really just need a half chord. Right? But when they translated this into Latin, it was actually mistranslated into the word bay, which is sinus, and that's where the word sine comes from. Now, these usually aren't the first three trig functions that students are introduced to, because when they discovered right triangle trigonometry and all of its applications, it actually kind of changed the definition of what a degree and what an angle was. So degrees and angles used to be measured the same way we measure radians. It was actually a physical distance, again, because it was rooted in astronomy. And so that changed when right triangle trig had all of these applications. So they actually redefined what a degree meant, and then created a definition of radian, which was the old definition of a degree. All right, so with this diagram, I took a unit circle and we added in these different secant lines, and we're going to look at where they intersect this tangent line. So if I take this little piece and I just rip it away from the line, right, I can measure these different distances as a function, right? This is the function of this tangent line. And we'll talk about, well, why is this distance of the tangent line in fact tangent, and we'll look at a diagram shortly. All right, so we can see that if I were to sketch this, right, I'm going to start to get a curve here, and if I were to continue it, well, I'm going to get steeper and steeper, and eventually I'm basically going to be approaching vertical. And in fact, when I'm at 90 degrees or pi over 2, this will never intersect, right? There would be no defined value in which those would intersect, right? Which is where the word undefined comes from when we're talking about slope. There's no defined value in which they intersect. Now, if I go past that, so I'm going to add just one more secant line. If I go past this and I have this secant line, right, that's going to eventually intersect at the bottom, but it's going to be the same distance as this one here. And right, so as soon as it picks up after the asymptote, tangent will pick back up. All right, so for the sake of time, we'll look real quickly at an animation that shows this at various points, and I'm just going to let this run for a second, and it shows that relationship between the circle, the definition of tangent, and the tangent graph. All right, now, well, why is this length tangent? Remember this little red half chord here, right? That is, we're going to consider sine, because vertically that was the most natural one that we cared about, was the vertical distance. And then if you go 90 degrees of that, if you look at the horizontal distance, this would be cosine, right? That's the complement of it. So sine over cosine in this similar triangle is the same thing as tangent over 1, right? So this would be our definition of tangent that we normally think of as opposite over adjacent, but actually all of those trigonometric relationships and those definitions didn't come until years later. All right, that's the end of my video. Hope you enjoyed it. Remember that one of the advantages of watching a video is that you can pause, rewind, replay, and this is something that you could always go back to if for whatever reason you find yourself needing to review this information. All right, have a good